The wind. That's the first thing I remember about those days. Not the gentle breeze of a Montana spring, but a howling monster that screamed down from the Bitterroot Peaks, clawing at the planks of the ranch house like a damned soul trying to get in. It carried a bone-deep chill and a shriek through the window panes that sounded like Mary weeping. And Thomas. 3 years. 1,095 days, and countless nights longer than a lifetime. For 3 years, the storm outside was only a pale reflection of the one inside me. I stood there in the dark oak study, the glass of whiskey in my hand gone cold. I hadn't taken a sip in an hour. I just stared at the portrait hanging above the dead hearth. Mary, with a smile that could chase away the harshest winter, holding our little Thomas, whose eyes were a perfect copy of hers. The plague had stolen them both, leaving me alone with 5,000 acres of land. More cattle than I cared to count, and a silence so heavy I could feel its weight pressing on my chest. That was why. When Mrs. Martha, the housekeeper, who had served my family since before I was born, announced she'd hired a new maid, I only nodded. The house needed cleaning, the fires needed stoking. I needed silent figures moving through the halls to fill the space, so I wouldn't have to face my own reflection in the dark windows. And then Alara Vance arrived. She came from Ellsbury on the morning stagecoach, carrying a small worn-out suitcase and a fragility that irritated me. She looked like a sparrow lost in a blizzard, her wheat-colored hair pinned in a neat bun, her gray eyes always fixed on the floor, as if she were afraid of her own shadow.
Where am I?
21, Mrs. Martha had said, but she looked younger. There was an old sadness in those eyes, defensiveness that made me realize she was also running from a ghost of her own. For the first few weeks, she was exactly what I'd expected. A ghost. She moved through the house almost soundlessly, cleaning, cooking, going about her duties with a quiet efficiency. She was afraid of me. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed whenever I entered a room, in the way she'd stammer Mr. Thorne and nearly flee from my presence. That suited me fine. Her fear was another shield between me and the world. I buried myself in ledgers, in numbers of cattle, profits, and land. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't make demands, and they didn't die. But at night, when the house fell silent, the numbers would blur. I'd be alone again with the wind. One night, unable to sleep, I went down to the kitchen for more whiskey. As I neared the door, I heard a whisper. It was her. Alara was washing dishes by the dim light of an oil lamp, her back to me. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was talking to herself. "You have to do better, Alara," she murmured, her voice trembling. "This is a good chance. The master is a fair man. Even if he looks so sad, you can't go back there. You can't let him find you. Him." That word, full of fear, stirred something in me, a curiosity I thought had long since died. Who was the him she was running from? The next night, a strange idea took hold of me. After supper, instead of going to my room, I stayed at my desk, loosened my collar, and pretended to fall asleep over my paperwork. I wanted to hear more. I wanted to know more about her ghost. I heard her light, almost non-existent footsteps as she entered the room to tidy up. She paused, and then I felt a gentle warmth as she took the wool blanket from the back of my chair and draped it over me. A small gesture, an unasked for kindness. My heart, a piece of muscle I thought had turned to stone, gave a dull ache. She didn't talk to herself that night. Instead, she stood before the portrait of Mary and Thomas. She was so beautiful, her voice was barely audible. And the little boy, too. "I know what it's like to lose everything, ma'am. I hope the master finds some peace someday." Her words were like a needle, piercing straight through the wound I'd tried so hard to hide. She saw my pain, and instead of fearing it, she sympathized with it. Every night after that, it became our silent ritual. I would pretend to sleep, and she would enter my solitary world, covering me with the blanket, adding wood to the fire, and sometimes she would whisper fragments of her life. I learned about her father, cheated out of his savings, about her broken family, about a promise she'd made to her mother. I was stealing her secrets, but I couldn't stop. Her whispers were the only human sound in this house that wasn't shrouded in grief. And then Silas Kane arrived. He was a snake in a man's skin, the owner of the adjacent ranch who had always coveted my land and its water rights. He walked into my study with a slick smile, his beady eyes missing nothing. "Jock, you look like hell," he said, his voice dripping with false pity. "Sell me that western strip. You don't need it anymore. You need quiet." "Get the hell out of my house, Silas," I growled. His eyes flashed with malice. "You'll be begging me one day, Thorn." Not long after, strange things started to happen. The fence on the east pasture was cut. A few head of cattle went missing. Jedediah, my old foreman who had worked for my father, said he found strange hoof prints near the creek. I knew it was Cain. He was probing, poking the wounded bear. In the midst of this, Lara broke through all my defenses with the simplest of acts. One night, as she entered the study, she placed a small tin on my desk. "Your hands, Mr. Thorn," she whispered, thinking I was asleep. "They're chapped from the cold. This is a balm my mother used to make. I hope it helps." The next morning, I opened the tin. A gentle scent of herbs and beeswax filled the air. I rubbed some of it into the cracked skin on my knuckles. Its soothing warmth was almost painful. Someone with next to nothing was willing to give away the little warmth she had. A few days later, she fell ill. I found her collapsed in the hallway, her face flushed with fever. A cold panic seized me. I had watched sickness take my family. I would not let it happen again. Without a second thought, I swept her into my arms. She was impossibly lightened. Yelled for Mrs. Martha, "Get Dr. Morrison now." Mrs. Martha stared, aghast. "Sir, for a maid, she's one of my people." I roared, and in that moment, I knew it was true. She was no longer a ghost. She had become something important. When Alara recovered, I called her into my study. She stood before my desk, her eyes still on the floor, looking even more fragile than before. "I'm promoting you," I said, getting straight to the point. "To housekeeper. Lighter duties, better pay." She looked up, her gray eyes wide with shock and fear. "I can't, sir. I don't deserve it. I decide who deserves what in this house," I said, perhaps more harshly than I intended. Her confusion frustrated me, and my frustration confused me even more. We entered a strange new phase. I found excuses to talk to her, asking about the flowers in the garden or the menu for dinner. They were clumsy, halting conversations, but they were like the first rays of sun after a long winter. One evening, as she brought tea, I was just staring into the fire. "Does the fire remind you of something, Mr. Thorn?" she asked softly. I was startled, but I chose not to push her away. "It reminds me of warmth. It's been a long time since this house felt warm." I looked directly at her. You've brought a little warmth back, Miss Vance." A blush crept up her cheeks. "Please call me Alara." Something inside me melted. "Then," I said, and I almost smiled, "you have to call me Jack." It was a turning point. But just as one door opened, another seemed to be closing. A few days later, the postwriter brought a letter from Missouri. I happened to be in the hall when he handed it to Alara. I saw the color drain from her face, saw her hands tremble as she quickly hid the letter in her apron. The look on her face was pure terror. He had found her. I knew it. At the same time, Cain grew bolder. He sent his men to town to cause trouble, making lewd remarks to Alara when she was shopping. I was there. I grabbed one of them by the collar and threw him out of the general store. The gossip spread like wildfire. The rich widower rancher was protecting his little maid. I decided I didn't care. The following week, there was a barn dance at the Miller's ranch. I hadn't attended a social event in 3 years, but I was going to this one, and I was taking her with me. When I asked her, Alara looked like she was about to faint. "No, I couldn't, sir. ... Jack. Everyone will stare. They'll talk. Let them talk." I cut her off, my voice firm. She wore a simple blue dress. But in the lantern light of the barn, she was the most beautiful woman there. When I held out my hand to ask her to dance, the entire room went silent. I could feel hundreds of eyes on us, could feel the dagger-like stare of Silas Cain from a dark corner. I ignored them all. I pulled Alara into my arms. and we began to move to the music. She was stiff with nerves at first, but then I whispered, "It's just you and me," and she relaxed. She smiled, and then she laughed, a clear, joyous sound that made my heart skip a beat. In that moment, I forgot the grief, forgot the past. There was only her, on the ride home, under the silver moonlight. As our buggy passed through a narrow cut, there was a sudden roar. A large boulder crashed down from the mountainside, blocking the road directly in front of us. The horses reared, screaming in panic. My heart seized. This was no accident. This was a warning. Kane was telling me that Alara was my weakness, and he was right. The tension between us after that night was almost unbearable. I wanted to protect her, to keep her in my sight, but my attention only seemed to push her away. She grew quiet again, fearful. The fear in her eyes was no longer just for her past, but for me, and then I lost her. I woke with a strange, cold feeling. The house was too quiet. I went downstairs. There was no smell of coffee. The fire in my study was cold. On my desk, where my ledgers were neatly stacked, was a slip of paper. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Thorne. I will never forget your kindness. But I cannot bring any more trouble to you. Please, forget me." Evie, a dark, hot rage erupted in me, burning away all the grief and apathy. Forget her? The foolish girl. Didn't she understand? She was the only thing anchoring me to this world. To let her go out there alone, with men hunting her and the cruelty of this land, was a death sentence. I didn't waste a second. I ran to the stables, saddled Desperado, my fastest horse, and stormed out of the gates like a whirlwind. I had only one thought: find her. Find her and bring her back. No matter what, I rode like a madman to the next stagecoach. Stop. The only place she could have gone to, head east.
Where am I?
When I arrived, the yard was empty except for one coach preparing to leave. I leaped from my horse, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I heard a muffled scream from behind the saloon. I drew my Colt, the familiar weight of it in my hand, and moved cautiously around the back. The sight before me turned my blood to ice. 3 filthy, cruel-looking men had Alara cornered. One had a fistful of her arm, another was laughing that ugly laugh. "You can't run forever." "Girlie," the leader said, a greasy smile revealing yellow teeth. "Your daddy's debt is your debt now." He reached out a grimy hand to touch her cheek. "Take your hands off her." My voice came out low, but cold as steel. They turned, surprised. I was standing at the corner of the building, my body blocking their escape. The Colt in my hand aimed squarely at the leader's chest. He sneered. "And who are you, hero?" "I'm the man who's going to send you to hell if you don't get out of here right now." The air grew thick. For a second, no one moved. Then, the leader's eyes glinted. He went for his gun. Time seemed to slow. I didn't think. I acted. A flash erupted from the muzzle of my gun. The deafening roar tore through the quiet morning air. The leader crumpled to the ground, a small hole appearing in his shirt, blood beginning to bloom. His own gun fell to the dirt with a dull thud. The other 2 froze, their faces white with shock. The barrel of my Colt was still smoking, and now it was pointed directly between the eyes of the man holding Alara. There was no mercy in my gaze. "Anyone else want to try?" I growled. They dropped their weapons in terror, scrambling backwards before turning and running as if the devil himself was on their heels. The air was quiet again, filled only with the acrid smell of gunpowder and Alara's ragged breaths. I holstered my gun and strode toward her. She just stood there, trembling, her eyes wide as she stared at me with horror and something else I couldn't read. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight. She was limp against me, burying her face in my chest. I could feel every tremor that racked her body. "I'm here," I whispered into her hair, my voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm here. No one is going to hurt you again." I had saved her. I had brought her back from the brink. But as I looked into her eyes, I didn't see relief. I saw a wall that had just been thrown up, higher and colder than ever before. I had shown her the monster inside me, and I was terrified that it had just pushed her away from me for good. The carriage ride back to the Riverbend Ranch was the longest journey of my life. The air inside grew thick, heavy with the faint smell of gunpowder, and a silence more terrifying than the gunshot. Elara was scrunched in the farthest corner, hugging herself as if she feared she might shatter into 1,000 pieces. She wouldn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the white landscape rushing past the window, but I knew she wasn't seeing any of it. She was replaying the horrific scene at the stagecoach stop. Seeing a monster she never knew existed inside of me. I had saved her, but I felt I had lost her. The tenderness, the fragile trust we had built over the past weeks, had been blown away by a single gunshot. I had shown her my dark side, the cold violence a man needs to survive in this land, and I could see the fear in every line of her body. She had run from one monster in Missouri only to fall into the arms of another in Montana. When we arrived home, Mrs. Martha ran out, her face pale with worry. Elara slipped past her, whispering something about needing to rest, and disappeared up the stairs like a phantom. I stood there feeling emptier than ever, the colt at my hip heavy as a judgment. That night, I didn't pretend to sleep. I sat in my study, the whiskey bottle open, but I didn't touch it. I just sat in the darkness, listening. The house was deathly quiet again. There were no whispers from the kitchen. No soft footsteps in the hall. Her silence was now an accusation. I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to break down this wall before it turned to stone forever. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating strangely fast, and knocked softly on her door. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder. Elara, we need to talk. After a long moment, the door creaked open. She stood there, a silhouette in the dim lamplight, her face pale. There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Thorne. Hearing the name Mr. Thorne was a knife to the gut. Yes, there is, I said, my voice firmer than I intended. In my study, now. She followed me downstairs, keeping a safe distance, as if I were a wild animal. In the study, I closed the door. The sound seemed to make her flinch. I pointed to the chair opposite my desk. Sit down. She sat, her hands clenched together in her lap. I leaned against the desk, crossing my arms, trying to find the words. I need you to tell me the truth, I began. The whole truth. About Missouri? About the man you're running from? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. That has nothing to do with you.
Where am I?
It became my business the moment I had to point a gun at a stranger to save you, I said. My voice devoid of anger, filled only with a deep weariness. You carry a ghost with you, Elara. I can see it in your eyes. I can't fight an enemy I don't know. She was silent for a long time, the only sound her choked sobs. Finally she began to speak, her voice a broken whisper. She told me about her father, a kind but gullible man who had borrowed money from a ruthless lender named Barlow to invest in a failed business venture. Barlow was a powerful man in their small town, a spider with a web that reached everywhere. When her father died of a heart attack, Barlow came to collect. He didn't want money. He told Elara she could pay off the debt by working in his saloon, a place notorious for its depravity. She knew what working there meant. She had fled that night with only a few dollars and the clothes on her back. Taking the first stagecoach west, when she finished, she buried her head in her hands and wept. The cries of someone who had held it in for too long. I walked around the desk and knelt in front of her. I had expected to feel anger, but I didn't. Instead, a profound empathy washed over me. Barlow, Cain, they were just different names for the same kind of evil. I gently pulled her hands away from her tear-streaked face. Look at me, Elara. She looked up, her gray eyes now flooded with pain. We all have ghosts, I said softly. Mine hang right there above the fireplace. The question isn't whether they exist. It's whether we face them alone or together. In that moment, the wall between us crumbled. She looked at me, really saw me, and I saw her. Two damaged people, battered by life, looking for a safe harbor. She said nothing, only nodded weakly. But it was enough. But it seemed fate had no intention of leaving us in peace. A few weeks later, just as a fragile calm began to settle over the house, the worst blizzard in a decade hit. The wind howled like a hungry demon, and the snow fell so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Jedediah had warned me, calling it the granddaddy of all storms. We had moved the livestock into the barns, boarded the windows, and prepared for a long siege. But then,
Oh my God, Jack!
amid the roar of the storm, a memory struck me. The pregnant cows. We had moved them to the south meadow, where the grass was better, a few miles from the main ranch. In the chaos, we had forgotten them. Among them was Daisy, the cow Mary had loved most. I couldn't leave them. You're crazy, Jack.
Hold still.
Jedediah yelled when he saw me pulling on my sheepskin coat and saddling Desperado. It's suicide out there. Those cows ain't worth your life. I'll be back, was all I said. But when I glanced at Alara, who stood in the kitchen doorway with a face as white as the snow, I saw a fear greater than any storm. I just nodded at her, a silent promise, and rode out into the white maelstrom. It was a mistake. The storm was worse than I imagined.
Not now.
The wind whipped at my face like needles of ice, and the snow disoriented me. I nearly rode in circles before I found the herd, huddled together behind a rock outcropping, shivering in the cold. I tried to drive them, but they were too frightened to move. And then disaster struck. Desperado slipped on an ice-covered rock hidden by the snow. I heard a sickening crack in his scream of pain. He had broken his leg. I stood there, in the middle of the blizzard, my loyal horse dying, the herd unmovable. The cold began to seep into my bones. I knew I wasn't going to make it back. A strange sense of acceptance washed over me. Perhaps this was the end. I would be reunited with Mary and Thomas in this storm. I sat down next to my horse, closed my eyes, and let the cold consume me. I don't know how long I was there. Time lost all meaning. I began to drift, seeing lights, hearing Mary's voice. But then the voice changed. It grew more urgent, more real. "Jack, Jack, wake up!" I forced my eyes open. Through the thick curtain of snow, I saw the faint glow of a lantern. And then I saw her Alara. Her face was raw from the cold. Her hair had come undone and was whipping in the wind, but her eyes burned with a fierce, stubborn fire. She had come for me. The little sparrow had flown into the heart of the blizzard to find the foolish bear. She pulled me to my feet, my body stiff and numb. "Lean on me," she yelled over the wind. With a strength I couldn't believe, she half-carried me, step by agonizing step, fighting against every gust. We found an abandoned shepherd's hut,
Can't lose you.
a dilapidated shelter that was barely a roof over our heads. Alara dragged me inside, slamming the flimsy door shut. I was shaking uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. I knew I was dying. "Take off your clothes," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. She used her own numb hands to strip off my soaked frozen layers. When I was down to my undergarments, she took off her own thick coat, then lay down beside me on the cold dirt floor, pressing her body against mine.
Where am I?
Transferring her own life heat into me, the warmth of her body was a shock to my system. "Don't you give up, Jack," she whispered in my ear, her breath warm, her hot tears falling on my cheek. "You survived losing your family. You're stronger than this. Fight for me." For me. Those two words pulled my soul back from the brink. I weakly wrapped my arms around her, and in that wretched hut in the middle of a blizzard, two broken souls found the warmth to survive together. When I woke, I was in my own bed. The weak morning sun, after the storm, was filtering through the window. The last wall of ice inside me had completely shattered. It was no longer about protection or empathy. It was love. A fierce, desperate, and undeniable love. Our relationship changed after that night. No longer master and servant, no longer fearful. We were two survivors, bound by an invisible thread. But as the snows melted, the snake Silas Kane slithered out of his hole. He couldn't attack us with violence, so he used the venom of rumors. Word spread through the valley that I, the wealthy rancher, was taking advantage of a poor orphan maid, that I had ruined her. But that was just the beginning. His fatal strike came in the form of a lawyer's letter. Kane, through a corrupt attorney in Helena, had found a loophole in my father's old land deeds. He was claiming that my right to use the water from the river that ran through the river bend was invalid. Without water, my ranch would die. The land would be worthless. It was an attack on the very lifeblood of my family's legacy. The pressure was immense. The risk of losing everything my father and I had built made me irritable and distant. I buried myself in paperwork again, but this time not to escape, but to fight. Ilara did not retreat. Instead of being scared off by my silence, she walked right into it. Every night she brought tea to my study and sat with me, poring over my father's old, dusty ledgers. The answer, she said, had to be somewhere in the past. One night, surrounded by a mess of papers and an uncertain future, I looked at her. Her face was intent in the lamplight, determined and strong. I realized then that I could not lose.
Oh my God, Jack.
I could not lose this house, the house that now held her. Ilara, I said, my voice hoarse. She looked up. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, I said bluntly. I might lose everything. This ranch, this land, I might be left with nothing. I took a deep breath, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to face it without you. Marry me, Ilara. Let's fight this together. Her eyes widened, then filled with tears. She said nothing, just rose, walked around the desk, and placed her hand on my cheek. Yes, she whispered. I'll marry you. Our wedding was a quiet affair in the parlor, witnessed only by Mrs. Martha and Jedediah. It was no grand ceremony, but a vow, a declaration of our solidarity against the world. A few days after the wedding, Ilara found it. Tucked inside an old ledger everyone had overlooked was a handwritten letter. It was an informal agreement between my father and Cain's father from decades ago, in which Cain's father acknowledged Riverbend's permanent water rights in exchange for passage across our land.
Where am I?
It was signed and witnessed. It was the silver bullet we needed. But somehow Cain knew we'd found something. He grew desperate. And a desperate man is the most dangerous kind. That night, the frantic barking of the dogs woke me. I looked out the window and saw an orange glow dancing near the barn. Fire! I yelled to wake Ilara and the hands, grabbed my rifle, and ran outside. Cain and about 4 of his men were there, throwing kerosene and torches. They didn't just want to burn the barn. They wanted to burn it all down. A fierce battle erupted in the darkness, lit by the leaping flames. Gunshots rang out. My men, loyal and brave, fought at my side. We were pushing them back, but then Cain, in a fit of madness, did the unforgivable. He slipped through the fight and grabbed Ilara as she was trying to douse flames near the main house. He put a pistol to her head. "Everybody, stop," he shrieked, his voice cracking with hatred. "Thorn, you drop your gun, or I'll blow your wife's pretty head off." My world stopped. The ranch was burning. My men were fighting. But all I could see was Ilara's terrified eyes and the black muzzle of the gun pressed to her temple. I faced a choice. My legacy or my soul. It wasn't a choice. I slowly placed my rifle on the ground.
I can't lose.
"You win, Cain," I said, trying to keep my voice steady.
Not now.
"Let her go." Cain laughed, a manic sound. "You think it's that simple?" It was then that Ilara, my small wife, who had once been afraid of her own shadow, acted. She stomped down hard on Cain's instep with her heel. He screamed, and his grip loosened slightly. In that split second, she drove her elbow backward, hard, right into his gut. Cain staggered, and that was all the opening I needed. I launched myself forward like a panther, no longer a rancher, but a man protecting his mate. The struggle was over quickly. Jedediah and the others subdued Cain and his men. His conspiracy was laid bare for all to see as dawn broke. Chasing away the darkness and leaving a gray, ashen sky, Ilara and I stood in the yard, looking at the smoldering ruins of the barn. We had lost a part of it, but we had one. I turned and pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying my face in her smoke-scented hair, and for the first time in 3 years I cried. Not tears of loss, but of relief and of love. "You saved us all," I said, my voice shaking. The sheriff took Silas Cain away. When the full story came out, the town rallied behind us. They no longer looked at us with judgment, but with admiration. 1 year later, I stood on the porch, hand in hand with Alara, looking out at the revitalized land. The Riverbend Ranch was not only rebuilt, but it was thriving. Spring had come, bringing with it a lush green and wildflowers blooming on the hillsides. From inside the house, we could hear the clear, bright laughter of a child, our son Samuel. I looked at my wife, the woman who had walked into my life as a sparrow and was now an eagle. The fragility was still there. It was now wrapped in an unbreakable strength. "You said tomorrow is a new day," I said softly. Squeezing her hand, Alara smiled. A smile that could chase away any winter, and leaned her head on my shoulder. "And we'll face all of them together." The storm had passed. I was finally home.